We ask that you stay on mute the whole time. And we have a new request from one of our panelists that you keep your video on. We want to see you. Just make sure you're clothed and you don't take us in weird places, but please keep your video on. We will open the floor for questions at the end. You can submit your questions through the chat feature at the bottom of your screen, and Jackie Gladstein will ask on your behalf. So today's topic is Israel Today, A Light Unto the Nations, featuring Lieutenant Colonel Eyal Dror, Daniel Diker, and Shaul Zohar. Eyal served in the IDF for 24 years, the majority of which he spent in coordination and liaison units working with the Palestinian population. From 2016 to 2018, he established and commanded the Good Neighbor Directorate, an operational unit under the IDF Northern Command, whose function was the management of humanitarian assistance to Syrian civilians, the victims of the civil war. And Dan Diker is an author and senior research fellow at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and Itech Global Business Board member. And Shaul Zohar, alumna of the Itech and past manager of the Itech in Kiryat Shmona for 30 plus years. Currently, Shaul is our coach's coach at Itech's Coaches Training School and also established a tennis program for 72 special needs children in northern Israel. Shaul will be speaking about his experience in helping Lebanese civilian refugees integrate into Israel through the Itech. And now I will turn this over to Dan Diker.
Thank you very much, Wendy, and thank you, Jackie. This is a special lunch and learn. I was fortunate enough to meet Eyal through two different pathways. One is that the extraordinary program, humanitarian program that he was commander for, was actually one of the best kept secrets in the international community, even the Jewish world, but one of the best and most celebrated stories in Israel. During the latter half of the Middle Eastern Islamic revolutions, which has claimed hundreds of thousands of Syrian lives. And Israel, for humanitarian reasons, ethical reasons, strategic reasons, made it a priority to help Syrian civilians in southern Syria. And many of you read the introduction to this lunch and learn and saw the thousands of Syrian lives that have been saved and protected by Israeli medical interventions and humanitarian generosity. I thought it's a perfect parallel value program for those of us at Itech, because these are the types of values that founded the Israel Tennis Education Centers, and those values that define Israeli society at large. And when it comes through the army, which has been so terribly maligned in the international community in these past number of years, thought it would be great to bring you right into the heart of the story, one of the great stories of humanitarian assistance by the Israeli army, the Israel Defense Forces, which I believe in. I like to call on Eyal to help me put this in context, that I don't think there's any army in the free world that is engaged in this type of unilateral humanitarian assistance on the scale that the IDF has. So Eyal, if I can call on you to share with us just a little bit of tell us what the program was, why it got started in 2016, and how you managed the complexities of it in southern Syria.
Okay. So good afternoon or good morning, everybody. As Dan and Wendy said, my name is Eyal Dror. I recently retired after 24 years serving my country as an IDF officer. I'm still serving as a reserve officer in the Bashan division, which is the division that taking control and protect the Israeli-Syrian border. And with your permission, I will share with you some slides in order to put the context. Two words about the situation that brought us to the Good Neighbor Project. The Israeli-Syrian border was very quiet for 40 years, since the end of 73 war until 2011. In 2011, something happened in the Arabic world. Most of you will know as the Arab Spring. Demonstration against the regimes, the totalitarian regimes. And in Syria, it became a very tragic event. It began in the beginning of 2011, but not like most of the Arab countries, it became a terrible civil war. A war that still continues until these days. A war that cost the lives of 1 million people, 6 or today it's even 7 million Syrians had to escape from their homeland. They are refugees. And you can see by those pictures, the damage, a severe damage to the infrastructure. Experts estimated in hundreds of billions of dollars, and it will take centuries to rebuild Syria again. And how it impacts Syria. So please take a look at that map. You can see here the Israeli-Syrian border, 100 kilometers, it's approximately 60 miles of very quiet border. Unfortunately, because the civil war, what happened, that we found the ISIS, you can see the black spot, ISIS, the people that slaughtering people all over the world, waving their knives and swearing to kill all the Jews. They were sitting on that piece of border. Imagine yourself, 15,000 Israelis living here in these areas, opening the window of their homes and watching ISIS. The red area was controlled by the Assad regime, but it wasn't Assad regime that it was until 2011. It was Assad regime with the forces of Hezbollah and Iran. And even in the green areas, we saw presence of some very extremist organization like Jabhat al-Nusra. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this name, but Jabhat al-Nusra, it's Al-Qaeda. Now I'm sure that most of you are understanding who were sitting on that border. And another reason is that you can see, I will show you now 2 pictures, and you will be able to understand how 250,000 people were living. People who were living in tents with a lack of electricity, with a lack of food, clothes, medicine, whatever we are thinking it's a basic needs for our lives, they didn't have it. Earlier, I led Jackie to see this picture, and I told her it's like my dinner Shabbat table, but it's not my dinner Shabbat table. This is an emergency room in a hospital in Kenetra. You can imagine yourself what is the chances for a wounded Syrian guy to survive if he will arrive this emergency room. And I will add just one more note that the doctor that will operate him, will do the surgeon, is a 2 years student who learned in university. And when the revolution started, he became a doctor. And he did medical procedures that in Israel and in the States, you should learn between 7 to 12 years until you're allowed to do this. So this is the context of the story. This is the introduction for the story. And if Dan will allow me, I will now share some more facts about how it began and how we reached the Good Neighbor. And then we can speak a little bit about the Good Neighbor Project, because the humanitarian aid of the IDF didn't start in 2016. It started in 2013, while 7 people, Syrian people, reached the border fence. Now, it's not like that, let's say, I will go and visit my friends. You should understand, Syrians were educated for centuries to hate the state of Israel. It's so simple. Now, I didn't Google it. I didn't read it on articles. I heard them telling me that. Hundreds of Syrians that we met with them told us the same facts. The regime propaganda was that Israel is the devil. Israel is an enemy. Israel will conquer Syria one day. Israel will destroy the Syrian land. So for those 7 people reaching the border fence, well, it wasn't something that nobody of us thought about. It can happen, but it happened. And when we asked them a simple question, weren't you afraid? They told us, we knew that we are going to die at that evening. And we asked them, so why did you arrive? Because they told us, with you it will be an easy death, not like with the regime. But surprise, the Israeli soldiers didn't shoot them. Israeli soldiers opened the border fence, opened the heart, and let them go inside Israel. We evacuated them to the Israeli hospitals, and since that night, 4,500 people entered the state of Israel, including this boy, 14 years old boy, and you can see the injuries. One of the most terrible scenes I experienced in my life, because it was entire family, which is an explosive, hit their home. There was total civilians, but when the regime is throwing bombs from a helicopter, it hit homes, it hit people, and this is the consequences. So 3 years, 2013 to 2016, 4,500 people is reaching the state of Israel, entering our hospitals, 99% of them going back to Syria after the Israeli doctors saved their lives. And this is the beginning of the trust that has been built between Israel, the IDF, and the Syrian civilians, which led in 2016 to Operation Good Neighbor. So this was the introduction, and Dan, you can now continue with your questions, please.
Eyal, part of the operation of the bringing the 4,500 civilians was setting up a first-rate medical camp in the northern Golan Heights. And I know that you were there commanding, one of the commanders of that entire operation. Can you tell us a story or two that have been told to the Israeli public, and people were just stunned by what they heard, by some of the stories, even to the extent at which, according to your introduction, Israel actually, and this has not been published, actually took care of Al-Qaeda terrorists and sent them back to Syria, where they would then continue their jihad against Israel.
So regarding to the last question, I will answer it very simply. When they reached the border fence, we didn't ask them, weren't you Al-Qaeda? For our point of perspective, they were human beings. We didn't check IDs. We didn't collect intelligence about people that reached the border fence. So yes, some of them might have been our terrible enemies. But when they were reaching the border fence, wounded, we didn't ask them question. I can say proudly, and I don't think it is cynical or hypocritic to say that we are Jewish people. And I was educated at my home, like most of you, about values like mutual aid and compassion. For me, while I was on a border fence, seeing a man in need, I didn't ask a question. I opened the border fence and let him go inside. So this is about the Al-Qaeda. But I want to share with you, yes, 2 stories about 2 amazing projects. I think that it will be able to understand through them a little bit about how unique was this project. The first story is about an operation, we called it a doctor's visit. I told you that until 2016, we only treated wounded people. Doctor's visit was an operation that take care just for children, but not wounded children suffering from chronic diseases, diabetic, problem in the heart, in their eyes, in their ears, everything that in our world, you just need to go to see an expert doctor. He maybe sent you to an ultrasound exam. I don't know, give you the correct medicine, you will be able to continue the normal life. In Syria, it doesn't exist. And please join me to the border fence. It's the same border fence that you can see just behind me. It's the same area, the southern part. And take a look at that picture. I told you that it wasn't like going to visit my friends. Yes, you can see a mother and a child, and it's, believe me, it's very exciting to see and to meet people, civilians. But what happened in that moment is that, and it is very important to understand, we were risking our lives. The topography of this area means that the enemy is higher up than me. Everybody can shoot me. Everybody can launch a missile. Even these women can bring a present. You know, when we are speaking about presents in the Middle East, it's from the, not the nice thing, it's from the kind that make a boom. And why? Because she was forced by Al-Qaeda or by ISIS to do so. So every time we go to the border fence, it was a huge risk. And this was the doctor's visit operation, to bring this beautiful girl to the expert doctors. But I told you that it was one of the most exciting experiences that I had in my life, because we had the ability and the opportunity to meet Syrian children. Syrian children, unfortunately, they are not like your children or mine. Syrian children living in an inferno. They do not have basic things. This boy, for example, told me that he didn't take a shower for a month because there wasn't any water at his home. This girl told me that they are running and escaping from the bombing of the regime. So she had to change 12 homes in 6 years. Can you hear what I'm saying? 12 homes in 6 years. And this beautiful boy, I asked him a very simple question. I asked him, when you will be adult, what do you want to do? Very easy question. When I asked my daughter, she's 9 years old, she's changing her mind. She wants to be a famous dancer, a famous lawyer, a famous doctor. This boy wasn't response. Now, believe me, my friends, my Arabic is much better than my English. He understood what I asked him. He didn't answer for twice. And just on the third time, he answered. When he spoke, I was almost sorry for asking him the question, because he told me a very simple answer. I will not be an adult. I will not be an adult because in a year or two, I will die. And I was in shock. I remember myself freezing and asking him, why are you saying this? And he told me, because this is what happened to my classmates. My friends died. This was the Syrian children reality. And why it's so exciting? Because when we had the opportunity to make them smile a little bit, when we understood that what we are doing, we gave them hope. And again, sorry for being annoying. I will take you back. When you read the Holocaust survivor testimonies, you find a very interesting thing. What kept them alive was the hope. And this is what we did in this project. And at that moment, believe me, I forgot that I'm an IDF officer. I just remember that I'm a human being and I'm doing the right thing to do as a human being without asking, are you a Syrian? Are you a Muslim? It doesn't matter. Jews, Muslims, Israelis, Syrians, human beings helping, have the opportunity to save lives. So this was, for me, the most exciting part of Operation Good Neighbor. In these doctors' visits, we treated 1,400 children. And the second interesting part of this, it was the collaboration. We're speaking a lot today about collaborations and collaboration. I can talk to you about cross-faith collaboration. I want you to please think how many times in history Jewish people and Christian and Muslims collaborate together against or against something. Maybe you will find those examples, but I encourage you to think how many times in histories Jews, Christians, and Muslims were collaborating together under the command of an Israeli officer to save Muslims' lives. I don't think it ever happened in the history. And this is a good example. A field clinic, and Dan spoke about it, a field clinic built behind the fence, eastern to the fence. Now, I will make it a little bit complicated for you because, you know, we're in the Middle East, and in the Middle East, nothing can be very easy. You remember the black spot of ISIS on the map? It was just a mile from here. I don't know how many of you, but ISIS do not like Christians also. But this Christian organization, Friendship Unlimited, from United States, from Louisiana, chose to risk their life to join the Good Neighbor Unit and to establish this amazing facility in which Syrian people got just a simple treatment. It was a daycare, not a surgery place, not experts, just a doctor that can examine you and gives you the piece of antibiotics you want. In Syria in these days, you didn't have basic antibiotics. And if you had so, you had to pay $20 for a packet. When your salary was 40, nobody will waste half of his salary for some medicine. But again, we spoke just earlier about hope. So take a look at these pictures. This team built in one of the tents a huge playground for the Syrian children to play. Now, try to figure out the meaning of children who were educated that Israel and the state are the enemies. You know, you, the people who is living in the state, you're perceived to be called like the big devil, and we are just the small one. But think about those Syrians people, 8,000 of them entered this facility in more than a year, finding some Americans, hugging them, offering them a coffee. And they understand that they are there because the authorization of the state of Israel and the idea of protect on them. And they had the ability for just one day to go back and become normal children, to eat ice cream. Did you know that in Syria you don't have ice cream? When I speak with young people, I ask them always, when was your last time eating ice cream? Well, if it's winter time, they will tell me my last time was 3 months ago. This girl, it was the first time in her life eating ice cream. This boy, it was the first time hugging a teddy bear. It was a life changer for them. For the mothers, for the parents, it was simply 10 hours to sit, relax. Do not think, is today going to be my last day? Is today I'm going to be bombed, to be kidnapped, to be murdered, to be raped, or brutally stolen? This is what happened in Syria in those days. This operation make all of the things happen. Hope with saving lives. Dan Rich came back. Jackie, can you see if Dan came back?
Yep, I'm here.
Dan is
I'm
back.
right.
Dan is
I
back.
came back. I'm
Okay,
back.
so-
I'm back, and I'm savoring every moment of what you're saying. Two questions, Eyal. Context. This was a humanitarian operation of the Israeli Defense Forces, in which Israel was not an active part in the conflict in Syria and Iraq and across the Middle East, as Iran was trying to destabilize every single country in the region, and with its Syrian partner at the cost of hundreds of thousands, even more than 1 million lives. Now, bring us into what they call in Hebrew the Hamal, the Cheder Milchama, the war room, where you and other commanders were talking about what the motivation was to go into southern Syria and spend, I don't know what the budget was, but I believe it was in the hundreds of millions of shekels of Israeli dollars
in order to help save these children. Share with us a moment or two of the discussions between the senior officers of the Israeli army in why the army wanted to get involved in this operation.
So first of all, as you mentioned, nobody forced us to do so. We could have sit behind the Israeli fence, and if Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, ISIS will try to attack the Israeli citizens, the Israeli villages, the IDF knows how to deal with them. We saw here an opportunity. If you will check the Middle East, the countries around Israel, Syria is the only country that we haven't any contact with Syrian people. We had a peace agreement with Jordan and Egypt. It means, although in Israel we called it Shalom Kar, a cold peace, but it's not a war situation. Israelis met Egyptians, Egyptians met Israelis. Palestinians, of course, were living together for dozens of years. Even the Lebanese knows who are the Israelis. Syrians weren't aware of who are the Israelis. The thinking was that if we will be able to help them, first of all, they might change a little bit their minds. Now, in the Middle East, when something happened, it can last for decades ahead. This is what I will speak in when I will summarize my talk. But it was a thinking that with this opportunity to help them and to let them understand that Israel is not the enemy. The meaning of Israel is not the enemy is that they will not allow Hezbollah to sit on their villages. And it was in Israeli interest. But again, nobody forced us to do so. So when we discussed about it, now, when we speak about the Good Neighbor Project, nobody, I can tell you, nobody in the IDF believed it will be such a huge project. Nobody believed that we will do 700 humanitarians mission. Nobody believed that we will establish a maternity hospital in which 1,000 Syrian babies has been born in 2018. Nobody believed that we will build a full bakery and we will support 250,000 people. In the beginning, the thought was we will help just the villages on the border. It means the villages that in the, let's say, between the border and 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, 2 miles from the border fence. The Israeli assistance reached 40 kilometers inside. It's almost 30 miles. We create a partnership with so many people. So many Syrian people enjoyed from it. And when we understood that it is such a success, I got the permission from my commanders to continue and let's say continue sharing the message that Israel is not the enemy. And of course, when we want to increase, we need money. And you spoke about the money. The money was donated by more than 20 NGOs that we work with. And of course, some of the money was from the Israeli budget. But we understood that it is, again, the right thing to do for the present and for the future.
Eyal, thank you very much for those initial comments. I want to turn to someone who I think many of us who know what he does knows that he's also a hero of Israel, and that's Eyal Dror, who was one of the great influences on the young generation in Israel on the issue of good neighborly relations, on the issue of cooperation between Muslim, Christian, Jewish children, and somebody who was responsible for past decades, for bringing in Lebanese children to play at Israel, to play with our kids at the Israel tennis centers in the north. Eyal, can you share with us just a little bit of your experience from, I remember decades past when we started all working together with it was the late 70s and the early 80s, and I remember Shlomo Tzoref telling us about the Good Fence program, the Good Neighbors program, but it was the Good Fence program in which we opened the border from southern Lebanon into northern Israel, and these children would come in and play at Kiryat Shmona. And you, of which every single resident in Kiryat Shmona knows of your work and has echoed these wonderful achievements that you've helped us make throughout the rest of Israel. So share with us your memories and insights about the good fence program that the Israel Tennis Center had spearheaded.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Hello, everybody. I want to start with a little bit of background that Kiryat Shmona was bombed from Lebanon in the last 40 years. And only in Kiryat Shmona, we recall that there was about 7,000 Katyusha rockets fall on the Kiryat Shmona only. So you can imagine that people in my age, our childhood was most of the time being in a bomb shelter. And in 1982, when there was first Lebanese war, after this war, we opened the gate. Israel decided to open the gate, and we call it the good fence. So people from Lebanon could enter Kiryat Shmona and the Upper Galilee, and they used to come and walk everywhere. So the relationship became like you mentioned in Syria now, it was the same, but they could come and walk and live with us. And there was a good friendship between the people. And then in 2006, there was a second Lebanon war, and they closed everything again. And in 2000, when, sorry, I mixed with the date. Like in the year of 2000, when Israel decided to evacuate Lebanon and come back, there was many refugees. Most of them were from South Lebanese army who chased Israeli army, and they came back to the fence, and they became actually refugees in Israel. And one day, as I was the manager of the tennis center in Kiryat Shmona, I decided to go and check what is going on with these people. And I've noticed that hundreds of people were located in some centers. And I was shocked to see that they don't get what they deserve to get. And as a manager in the tennis center, I offered them, let's take these people. I want to make them busy with the kids, with the adults. And we find a way, and we brought something like 100 people, 100 South Lebanese people that used to be in the Upper Galilee. And then they stayed in Israel, and they became friends, they became tennis players. And I'm happy that we could be in the right place, in the right moment, that we can be something like to help these people to integrate in the Israeli society. And now they live in Israel, we know them, we still friends, they study, they joined the army, some of them are actually serving the IDF. So if there is more question about it, I will be happy to answer.
Shaul, did a number of the Lebanese Christian army, the former what they called Sadal, and
yes.
There we have some 40,000 Lebanese Christians from the South Lebanese Christian Army, the South Lebanese Army living in Israel today as full residents of the state of Israel. Were they involved with the tennis center under your management in Kiryat Shmona? Did they come and use the center and learn at the center?
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. In Kiryat Shmona, there was about 1,000 South Lebanese civilians that come, Christian. And as I mentioned, they playing tennis, they integrate in the society, they are doing everything. You know what? The nice story is that you don't recognize them. They look the same, they speak Hebrew better than me, and they are like everybody else. They integrate 100%, at least from what I know in Kiryat Shmona.
So let's open up for questions and comments. I'm wondering, I see that the Lippies and Ian Froman, and Ian, of course, was the first the first executive director of the tennis centers. It was, Ian, under your watch that all of these programs flourished. Ian, do you have a recollection about the Good Fence program that you can share with us? Do you remember those days with children streaming over the border?
It was the most incredible program, and the Good Fence opened, and these children with their leaders came through, and in fact, the commander of the Lebanese army at that stage was one of them, who became an addict at the Israel tennis centers, moved to Israel, and I still have from the 25th anniversary of the Kiryat Shmona, him speaking and writing the most incredible article of how we had saved him and all his children through tennis.
David.
So these are actually wonderful memories, and Shaul has brought it out, how fantastic it is. And it just reminds me of one saying, which I've mentioned before, of Mandela, who said that sport is a vehicle to bring nations together, as no other thing can do. And the Israel Tennis Centers, through this example of these Lebanese children and men who now living in Israel, had their first taste of the country through something normal, through the tennis centers that offered them this opportunity. So it was just one of those wonderful things that the Israel Tennis Centers has achieved. And one looks back with pride, as Shaul does, on those days and what has been achieved.
The 90s, I think it was 1996, I was sitting in the office in Kiryat Shmona Tennis Center, and all of a sudden, 6 South Lebanese soldiers came in with their, the armed. And I said, what a surprise, how can I help you? And in a few seconds later, General Antoine Lached approached to the room, and he said, "You are Shaul?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I want you to teach my son tennis." The chief of staff of South Lebanese Army, and he came and said, "I want you to teach my son tennis." I said, "With pleasure." And then his son came with his wife, and usually he used to come with the guards. And Rabia started to play tennis, and at the beginning, 2 soldiers used to do some like walking and make sure that nothing happened to him. And after 2 months, he used to come, and nobody, without any escort, he came and play. And I remember that I used to take him to tournaments in Tel Aviv, and I used to show him the country. And funny story, one day his mother came and she gave me an envelope with money. She said, "This is for you." I said, "No, it's a pleasure for me to work with Rabia, enjoying, and I cannot take the money." And she said, "What, my money is not good for you? You won't see us anymore." And I said, what a big mistake I make, and I didn't know what to do. And I believe that they consult with the officer, the Israeli officers, and they explain them that this is the way, like if some Israeli telling you that you are welcome and you don't have to pay, it's like showing you respect. And after a month, she came back and she brought me a box, and she would say, "Will you accept this now?" I said, "I will accept everything. Bring Rabia to the court and let's play." And I'm so happy that I refused to take the money, because she gave me a sword, to remember these days. And it was a Lebanese sword with something written on it. So that was the story. And now there are some South Lebanese kids who used to grow up at the tennis center. They have become adults. They're working everywhere. They are teachers. They are like all the other Kiryat Shmona civilians.
Thank you, Shaul. We have a question from Erwin Shore for Eyal. Did the U.S. withdrawal of the troops put the Israel Tennis Center's Israel at greater peril and risk?
Again, I didn't understand the question, please.
He would like to know if the withdrawal of the Israeli troops from Syria put Israel and the Israel Tennis Centers in Kiryat Shmona at greater risk.
Israel didn't withdraw from Syria. It mentioned maybe from Lebanon.
So where you can put both of the loads in. Look at this thing. So that
Jackson,
dwarf, he just kicks
Hey,
his
I'm
shoes
sorry,
off.
just one second.
Eyal, the
Yeah.
question was, the Americans withdrew some troops from southern Syria.
Syria,
And the question was, did that endanger Israel, the Israeli tennis centers, and areas in Israel's north more so than before the American troops had withdrawn from southern Syria when they relocated to Iraq?
Okay, so I can tell that it's not just a question about the tennis center, it's a question about Israel. When you have a good friend like the US, and when the US is involved in Syria, it's minimize a little bit the risk for the state of Israel. This is loud and clear. For example, today, the American presence in Syria is the eastern part of Syria in Deir ez-Zor, but this is very important for the Americans, but also for the Israelis. Why for the Israelis? Because the passage from Iraq to Syria is in this area, one of the passages. If it wouldn't be any American presence in that area, the Iranians will be able to use Iraq to send their Shia militias through Syria. So the American presence in the US, in the south, in Syria, is, from the Israeli aspect, is very good. The withdrawal, or for example, people speaking about not continuing with the sanctions. Now, I'm not involving in American politics. What I'm claiming is, from an Israeli point of view, from a military point of view, the sanctions, for example, is limiting the power of our enemies. And we can see it because of the sanctions, Iran paying less money for Hezbollah, the money that is not using for buying more rockets for Israel. The sanction led that they can pay less salaries for the Shia's warriors. It means that instead of 200,000 of them, there is just 100,000. So again, as Israelis, we need the help of the United States, of course. When the United States doing what is good for their interests, Israel will know how to protect itself. And you can hear, I'm sure that in the last 2 years, you have heard about a lot of missiles, explosives all over Syria. It's Israel's attacks against Iranian presence and Hezbollah presence in that area. So from one hand, we need this help because I don't think it's just the fight of Israel, it's the fight of the Western world against the radical Islamic government of Iran, using Syria, using Iraq to attack the only democratic country in the Middle East, but it won't stop in Israel. So it's very important that the Americans will understand it, the meaning of speaking with those people in the language that they are familiar and understand. And believe me, and it's not a racist or it's not all of these kinds of people trying to say. When you are dealing with them, you have to speak in their language. Unfortunately, Western do not understand the Arabic culture.
One of the things that Ian said here was so important when he was quoting Nelson Mandela, post-apartheid South Africa's first president, and himself a freedom fighter for many years. And that is that sport, especially, and in our case, tennis, is one of the great diplomatic tools. And today's session is really humanitarian diplomacy. And it just brings to mind this extraordinary and probably all too well-kept secret that the Israel Tennis and Education Centers just a few years ago invited, for the first time in Israel's history and in South Africa's history, 4 or 5 young Black South African children to Israel with their coach from Soweto. And it was really a breakthrough in tennis diplomacy. And I know that I see Erez Vider, our CEO, Executive Director, CEO on the call, and we've discussed, you know, making children and tennis diplomacy a major aspect of the Israel Tennis Centers. Seems to me that it is the strongest tool that Israel can use today is through the sport of tennis to have our young people be our best diplomats in countries that we do and countries that we don't even have diplomatic relations with, because we can reach out directly, as Ronen Morali did in South Africa. It seems to me that this can be one of the most extraordinary path-changing and watershed projects that we might be able to be to lead in the world is children's tennis diplomacy for the Israel Tennis Education Center.
Dan, that's so true, and I think we've seen evidence of it with Soweto and with the exchange that we did with the inner city program in Philadelphia. Right. And the humanitarian efforts start at home for the Israel Tennis and Education Centers. We do that on a daily basis internally in creating inclusion and unity and looking at people as people and upholding the same values that we have and standards that we have for ourselves, for them as well.
Clearly. So, how about any more questions or comments from all of our family here on the comments? Dan, also welcome.
Sure. Dan, can I make a comment?
Mr. Chairman, please.
I just think it's, I probably speak for a lot of people here, like learning the history of the Israel Tennis and Education Centers is incredible. And you've done such a beautiful job today. So I just want to tell you, like, I learned something, and I bet you there's a lot of people on this call that have known us for 40 years that have learned things on these calls. So I just think it's great. And secondly, I want to say that Shaul is my favorite person in the Israel Tennis Centers, and we all love him so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eyal. Thank you very much for joining us, Shaul. Always love to have you with us. We're so excited that you came on with us today. And Dan, you're the best.
Yeah.
Thank you for being the moderator and helping us to organize these spectacular lunch and learns for everyone. Wendy, would you like to take over now?
Yeah, no, thank you. This was amazing. Eyal, Shaul, Dan, thank you. I'm going to just turn this over to our very great Amy Hendrix, president of Itech's North American Board, to talk about an amazing upcoming event.
Thanks, Wendy. And Wendy, thank you for all the work you put into creating these amazing events. And Dan, the way you sum up what we do at the Israel Tennis and Education Centers is beyond brilliant. You put into words what we all feel in our heart, and we're so lucky to have you. The last few weeks, we've been inviting everybody to have lunch with us for our lunch and learns. And on July 28th, we're inviting you to bring a bottle of wine and your dinner and join us for an evening of art and comedy in celebration of Itech. And we have an amazing evening of fun outlined for you with Michael Israel, who is a performance artist, and he's going to be doing some amazing art and a special piece just for Itech. We'll be auctioning off his artwork. And then we have, what's his name?
Andy Ron.
Sarge.
Sorry, wow. We have Sarge the comedian, who is based out of Boca. He's a Black Jewish comedian that he's big in New York and Florida, so a lot of you might know him. I have to tell you, getting to know him for this event, I haven't stopped laughing. We've been on the phone for like 3 hours, and he just goes, he doesn't stop. He's hysterical. We're gonna have a talk on the situation in Israel and what's going on at our centers from Hans Filius. Whoa. That's Erez Vider. Hans Filius, who is director of tennis and social programming at our Itechs in Israel. And I can promise you we're going to have a lot of fun, a lot of laughs. you can all tape Jeopardy and watch it the next night. This is going to be worth watching. And we hope you'll all join us on July 28th from 7 to 8:30-ish. And we promise it's going to be an amazing evening. And I'm going to turn it back over to my sidekick, Wendy. Thank you for everything you do, Wendy. You did an amazing job on this, putting this together today.
Amy, thank you. Can't wait for to laugh with everyone on the 28th. Anyway, our next Lunch and Learn is on July 22nd with Andy Ram, 3-time doubles Grand Slam winner and former Israel Davis Cup player. So we hope you will all join us. We'll have amazing content with that as well. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. So thank you,
Jenny,
everyone.